Have you ever seen a movie called The Shining, directly by Stanley Kubrick? It's a film I would definitely recommend to anyone that even remotely enjoys scary movies. However, you've probably already seen it, you just don't know it yet. Even if you've never seen The Shining before in your life, if you started watching the movie right now, you would probably be able to predict the entire plot of the movie from beginning to end. This is because The Shining has embedded itself so deep into our pop culture that other movies can't help but take inspiration from it. The Shining was actually the inspiration behind a lot of horror movies you've probably already seen. So whether you know it or not, you've actually seen The Shining under a different name. In this speech, we'll be telling you about the pyramid plot structure used by The Shining, as well as comparing The Shining to other movies to showcase how similar they really are.
The Shining made classic horror plot structure into one of its own. According to the Freytag's pyramid, a plot structure consists of an exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. The Shining seems to follow this structure to a T, but in a spooky horror way. In the exposition, Jack's family is introduced along with their motivation and the setting. In the rising action, Jack begins to show symptoms of insanity, and his son Danny begins to see the ghosts that haunt the hotel. In the climax, Jack kills Dick in the hallway, Dick being a character that's helped Danny find what the Shining is, and chases Wendy and Danny around the hotel and the maze. In the falling action, Wendy and Danny begin to escape the hotel. In the resolution, we presume that Wendy and Danny are safe. And we presume also that Jack has frozen to death in the maze. But this ending is left to interpretation as there's a loose end at the end of the film. The final shot of Jack is shown in a picture, a very old picture, in a hotel party. So, horror movies have used this structure even before The Shining. Yet, in this Stanley Kubrick masterpiece, many horror films have been inspired by this. According to the New York Times, cult classics such as The Silence of the Lambs and The Thing were heavily inspired by The Shining. Now, if the audience could think of a horror movie, any horror movie at all, think of the plot structure that this horror movie follows. Now, try to compare this plot structure to The Shining. One thing you might notice is there's a loose end in the resolution. You might be wondering, did the characters live? Or what happens to these characters after they escape? Or maybe why is the world even safe from the evil that this movie contained? Unless this movie has a sequel, you probably don't know what truly happened at the end of the film, unless the director tells you. This plot structure has been popularized by The Shining, leaving a loose end open to interpretation by the audience. There are even more parts of this movie that inspired other movies besides the backbone of the plot structure, such as the events that occur.
In the exposition of the plot structure, it seems very similar, if not the same, in other movies, using weird sounds, noises, and ominous music to begin the buildup of suspense and anxiety. This can be seen in other horrors like Marianne, Don't Listen, and Insidious, where also their use of sounds and music at the start form the basis of the horror movie and the emotion that a horror movie is supposed to give off. In the movie The Shining, Jack was driven mad and became mentally unstable, caused by a demon that haunted the hotel where he worked at during the rising action. He then tried to kill his family when possessed in the state near the climax. Similarly, in another movie, The Amityville Horror, George Lutz was driven mad and became mentally unstable, caused by a demon that haunted his new house during the rising action. He then tried to kill his family when in this possessed state. Both movies similarly creating the same scenario, caused with near identical catalyst at the same time of the plot. Similarly, both movies within their plots, rising action and climax, have some sort of deja vu moment in which Sabrina Sterwalt, who writes for the Scientific Atlantic, describes it as an already seen moment. For example, in The Shining, Jack is told by his boss there was a man in the past who suffered a mental breakdown and tried to kill his family with an axe. Then later, Jack suffers a mental breakdown and tries to kill his family with an axe, creating a deja vu or that already seen moment. Similarly, in the movie The Amityville Horror, George Lutz finds out that the previous owner of his house suffered a mental breakdown and killed his family with a shotgun. Then later, George suffers from a mental breakdown and tries to kill his family with a shotgun. Both movies creating their sort of deja vu moment within their plot's rising action and climax, with very similar catalysts and end results. As college students, we've probably seen and noticed the similarities of movie genres during our Netflix and chills or lonely nights, but these similarities can also be seen in other movies like American Psycho.
The classic structure of the plot is commonly followed in many psychological horror movies in terms of the character's progression as well. A few movies that have been released in recent years also share similar plot characteristics even long after The Shining was released. The basic premise of the movie, which is replicated in many others, is that even an average person can succumb to internal antagonistic and evil feelings. This can be seen in the movie where something simple such as isolation pushed through the main character Jack Torrance to insanity and pushed him to attempt to murder his family. The slow descent into madness, being pushed by small incidents, is a plot story that can be seen in recent horror movies over and over again throughout the years. 20 years after the release of The Shining, American Psycho was released, which is similar in the same elements. It takes place in a very different setting, but their progressions are quite similar. In the same way that Jack Torrance descends into madness through isolation within the Overlook Hotel, Patrick Bateman, the main character in American Psycho, is a seemingly average person as well, without any signs of mental instability, but then slowly descends into violent fits and succumbs to interpersonal feelings of madness. Both movies show the improbable but harsh reality that no one is immune to internal antagonistic feelings, and that everyone may boil over one day into horrific violent fits. Nearly another 20 years after American Psycho, now 40 years after The Shining, its plot elements are still used and influential within the genre. Another popular psychological horror movie called Ma was released in 2019, and it shares similar progression elements as well, taken from The Shining. The main character of the movie is Sue Ann, who's a lonely middle-aged woman who initially appears to be an average person with no internal strife. And similarly, the two movies, small incidents happening to the main character cause them to slowly lose control of their sanity and cave into internal antagonistic feelings, succumbing to violent intentions in both movies. And after losing their sanity, it's a common theme throughout the psychological horror movies that have become so iconic because of The Shining and the way it presented the slow descent into madness.
Anyways, now that you know a bit more about The Shining's plot structure and how it compares to some of the other movies out there, I want to close this speech off by giving a brief recap of everything that we've discussed here today. Now, as college students and as young adults, we're always going to be watching movies at some point throughout our lives. Whether it's at home, in a movie theater, on a train, or in a car, I'm sure that you can agree that some movies are absolute thrillers while others may not be as much. However, I think it's always important that we take the time to recognize and appreciate some of the good movies out there. Now, one of the most iconic movies throughout the ages that has remained relevant is The Shining, written by Stephen King and directed by Stanley Kubrick and Mike Flanagan. As you may or may not know, The Shining is a movie that really defined the category of horror with its intense soundtrack and suspenseful moments. One of the reasons why The Shining is such a successful movie is because of its plot structure, consisting of exposition, rising action, falling action, climax, and resolution. As a result of its success, we can also see some aspects of The Shining fall into some other categories of horror. For example, we know that The Shining also shares some similarities with other modern-day horror movies, such as Marianne, Don't Listen, and Insidious. While its plot structure is also similar to other films, such as Amityville. Additionally, it shares some aspects of mental instability with some other horror movies, such as American Psycho and Ma. I would highly recommend watching this movie if you haven't already, and enjoy yourself while you're at it. Anyways, I want to close off this final speech by saying that this class has been an absolute blast, and I'm genuinely thrilled to be able to work and develop my speech skills with my group. As stated by Stephen King, monsters are real, and ghosts are real too. They live inside of us, and sometimes they win. However, by choosing to take this class, I like to think that we've defeated a monster inside of ourselves, and that monster is the fear of giving speeches.